that might only be half of the problem. Because there are some of us who need complementary hearing. And so I'm doing my part, having been told to speak up and use a microphone.
Thank you, Wally.
Can everybody hear me?
She can hear you. Yes.
You can hear me. Well,
Well, the mic is on.
the mic is up here. Are you happy?
For now.
George, would you pray us in?
Eternal God, we are inquiring this noon. If we have inquiring minds, we want to know. We have questions. Maybe we can't find all the answers, but help us to take what we do know. Trusting in your presence and affection for all of us. And then behave like we like us. Bless this food, because I'm about to eat it. Amen.
Now, making this presentation is almost more fun than I'm entitled to have. Because I focused on these issues since about 1955. And I've never been able to fully answer the questions they present to me. Let me simply start by saying I am a 100% almost Christian. Period, end of story. What does that mean? It means when Mary's in the pulpit, when I'm listening to Emily, George, Dougie, everybody but Larry. I believe the story. For me, it's a story. And it's a metaphor that helps me understand my understanding of God. There are 6 billion people in this planet, more or less, plus, depends on who did what last night. And 99% of them believe in a superior being. I happen to define that being as God. But some people define it as an energy source. They're all looking for something to explain the unknown. And for me, I've lived a life where I was raised as a Christian, in a family where I had a grandfather who was a preacher, who was a fire and brimstone guy, and he could lay it out. And I've spent a lifetime going to church every Sunday. I've even taught 7th graders in the Lutheran church back in Virginia. And I believe the story. But for me to understand what that means, I have to understand how Jesus became part of God. And that's where it gets interesting and fun. I liked Emily's presentation.
Thank you.
I did. There was one thing I had a problem with, and it was that you said it's a fact that Jesus was baptized. I'm not going to argue with you. I start from the premise that Jesus was crucified. That's all I have to believe. And then I build off that to a point where today I'm a Christian. Now, the fact is, I wouldn't be particularly welcome in the Roman Catholic Church. And I'm almost positive the Southern Baptists would scoff at me. But the fact is, I'm quite happy in the middle ground, which is a church that gives me the opportunity to think about my theology. Now, the reason I like this meeting, this group, is many of you are with me in this particular journey. How many have taken, now I know you're an EFM mentor. Anyone else here do EFM? Karen? Mary? I've done it. speak to. We got a lot of people. Douglas was my mentor when we were kids. A long time ago. But the reason I look at EFM as foundational is in 4 years, they give you an opportunity to sort of think your way through what Christianity is all about. And for me, I put some notes on the board. I don't expect anybody to be able to read them. Don't even try, because the spellings aren't right. And I'm at an age where I don't care if I can't spell everything correctly. But the fact is, pondering this question of how a guy who was an itinerant preacher in the countryside, probably had a girlfriend or was married, spent 30 years being a stonemason in Nazareth, had 4 or 5 brothers and sisters, father was Joseph, mother was Mary. How did he become so doggone important to us in our religion today? And that's the big question. Now, one of my favorite scholar authors is a guy named Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman wrote a book called How Did Jesus Become Christ? What an interesting question. That's what we're here doing. But he spent 8 years researching it, and I'm more or less prompting this discussion off 68 years of pondering without actually understanding how it all happened myself. I could have come in and done a book report on Bart's 8 years of research. But he took us from the crucifixion all the way, well, I don't know where I am, all the way to I'll go to Damascus, Pope Damascus, in 399, when he said, let's get this Bible in one common language. And out of that came the Vulgate Bible, which basically pulled everything together. But just to put this in context, by the way, is there anyone here who wasn't raised as a Christian? I'm not asking if you're a Christian today. Everyone was raised as a Christian. And we basically in our day, but for maybe Miranda and maybe Emily, we had the literal notion of the birth, the life, the story of Jesus pounded into our heads. There was never any question. Now, we've tried to modify our Christian education since then. But the fact is, we had it pounded into our heads. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But some of us still question. And the reason we question is because, at least for me, I'm in the process of evolving my theology. I know what the church teaches. I know what I learned in EFM, and I know what I learned in graduate school, and I know what I learned in all our discussion groups. But for me, it's a moving target. And I constantly am trying to figure out how I relate, how as a human I relate to God. So today I'm talking about God.
Amen.
Praise the Lord.
Not mine.
No, that's right.
I'll put it in context. Because for me, I think about it as a multi-level blue-side Chinese checker game, or a chess game. We're working on many different levels. It is hard to think back 2,000 years ago us and understand what was going on in that culture. It's absolutely clear it was not anything like we have today. The best I could come up with was let's go to Haiti and get in the voodoo cult. Because it was so complicated in terms of magic and magicians and all the dynamics of a community that was afraid for the future. Why is the Roman Catholic, new paragraph, why is the Roman Catholic Church doing so well in the big cities? Because their congregation is afraid for the future. Why is the Catholic Church not doing so well in middle-class communities? We're comfortable. It's pretty simple. One of my buddies, there's a guy named Charles Colson, deceased, and we were going to practice law together with former President Nixon. Well, that changed. Chuck went on to create a congregation. How did he do it? He found an audience where they needed to find Jesus to see a future. The prison ministry. So basically, I'm looking for a theology that allows me to be a member of the church, a Christian, somebody that understands this multidimensional Chinese checkerboard with moving parts 2,000 years ago, which is being promoted in the church I attend for worship today. What's wrong with that picture? A lot.
Nothing.
But I can't answer all the questions today, and you won't exactly get it off the board. But let me walk through a couple of dates. Let's accept that Jesus was crucified in about 33. Could have been 31, 32, or 30, depending how old he was. I don't care. We know he was crucified because Josephus wrote about it. Now, that demands that I explain why that's important. But I'm not selling anything here today. I'm just trying to put questions in your mind in such a way that helps you find your own path. Because everyone in this room is a seeker. We study together. We have for decades. I mean, you're a pretty easy audience. History demands authentication. And that means that you can't have history without writing. You've got to be able to analyze writing. So if you don't have any writing, there's nothing to rely on. You can't put yourself in somebody else's mind. You can't analyze it. So for the most part, you've got to have an authentic, original text, verified independently. So when we go through all this discussion, and people say, well, you've got the Bible. Look at the stories. They're all right there. That's what Jesus did. Except there are too many holes in that. It doesn't work. You can poke too many holes in it, and anybody who thinks much about these questions is going to be confused. And they'll walk away from their faith because they can't buy into the literal reading of the Bible. That's why I've had to think it through in a figurative way. And for me, none of it needs to be true, because I believe in the story. And the metaphor allows me to glean lessons for my life that Douglas, and Mary will explain to me, or I'll learn myself through my readings and everything. So having said that, there are some things we know, and I think there's a degree of, what was the word you used, Ben?
Speculation.
Yeah, we can there's some things we can speculate on and easily believe. I believe Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist and he was baptized. I believe that. I believe Mary was his mother, and so on and so forth. But as we walk through what the scholars have come up with, they've done it in a way that they've compared other literature with biblical text to come up with the dates. I've done it, but I'm now getting old and I don't care to do it anymore. But it's fun. It's a fun exercise. So what do we have? We got him being killed in 33, and that for me is a place to start. Then we've got, and this is where it really gets fun. We've got 4 Gospels. Mark was written about 70. All of you know this. I'm just refreshing your recollections. Luke and Mark were written to a pagan and a Jewish congregation. So they were slightly different, 15 years or so later. 85% more or less were Mark. Now think about it. We got Mark in Cody, Matthew in Matisse, and Luke in Pound, more or less. And they moved documents between those 2 villages and copied the story that was picked up to a developing congregation. Then we got John. John is really different, and I like John. 95 to 125. The scholars will argue. You can read one guy and he'll say 95, and another one will say 125. But we're now reaching out 100 years, almost, clearly from Jesus' time. And then what's happening is pretty exciting, because we have Gnosticism developing. Yep, that's exactly right, Em. What does Gnosticism even mean? It means a slice of God is present in the human being. Well, I believe that. I believe in the God gene. Remember, they scientifically have discovered that the human being is predisposed to believing in a higher being. We're genetically wired that way. So the question becomes, how are we going to act out that genetic wiring? We choose to do it as Christians. But Thomas is a pretty exciting guy. Thomas means partner. And Thomas was regarded as a partner to Jesus. And the Gospel of Thomas is regarded by scholars as basically being more accurate in terms of Jesus' writings and sayings than the Synoptics. Now, and it's just a series of sayings. What's interesting is that some of the sayings in Thomas show up in Paul's writing. Remember, Paul was back here between 33 and 70. He wrote from 55 to 65 when he ended up in Rome, differently than he really wanted to get there. Remember, good old Paul and Titus and Tim wanted to take their mission to Spain and they wrote to the 5 house churches in Rome, and I don't remember exactly when this was. Laura will know because she corrects me regularly, but I think it was about 55. Yeah. And they laid it all out. Well, they were trying to raise money and get over to Spain. But some of Thomas's sayings ended up in, I don't remember which one it was, maybe Corinthians, one of the letters to the churches that Paul wrote. But Paul, God bless his soul, is up here telling these small congregations how they should behave as Christians. Now remember, Jesus didn't think he was God. His followers didn't think he was God. They saw him as a rabbi, as an itinerant preacher in the countryside. So how did he become the risen Lord? That's where we get this cultural evolution. It's about time you got there.
I just came to give you a hard time.
Have at it.
Yeah, find a time for that.
I'm going over the part you already know, Warren. Don't worry. But where we get the Gnostics, for example, who were very active for about 200 years, we've got this evolution and conversation about what people were thinking about Jesus in the villages. We've got Paul, who's carried the story up into Greece and over into Rome, and it's an explosion. What happens? There's a reaction. And for about 150 years, we've got a reaction, and the Christian martyrs are willing to die for their faith. And we can all remember and think about what was happening in the Colosseum. They were willing to die for what they believed. What did they believe? Well, we're not sure yet, because there are too many different points of view. I'm fascinated with how the 4 Gospels ended up in the final text. No, I'm not. It wasn't until 367 that the Christian Testament took final shape. What do we know? We got a writing. We got a letter. I'm trying to remember his name. I think it was one of you got me. Bishop Athanasius.
Cody covered.
Athanasius wrote a letter, and he told his churches and monasteries, here is what we're going to accept as the Christian Testament. 1, 2, 3, 4, we're in there. Where was Thomas? Thomas was powerful. There were 52 Gnostic writings, 52 different letters that these people were all circulating. And by 367, it emerged into this book, which is heavy on Paul and has a story that we buy into. I buy into. But how much of it is true? Literal or figurative? So what happens? We got old Constantine coming into play. He was a Roman emperor who lived about 60 years 270 to 330 in that period of time. And it was during that period of time when it was not perfectly clear what version of the story was going to emerge. And to make a long story shorter, we've all heard about what happened at the Minerva Bridge, where he had his troops put crosses on their shields, and they won. And he said, well, Christianity can't be all bad, or something like that. And 313, a couple of years later, there was the edict of Milano, gave property back to the Christians and made them legitimate. We're moving right in the right direction. What happens in the year 325? Well, Arianism is prevalent. What is Arianism? It's accepting that Jesus was truly human. And it was creating all sorts of problems, politically. So they had this meeting in a resort town at Nicaea. And there were 3 different letters written by participants telling what happened. They got the 3 letters. A fellow wrote a book. He was the metropolitan of the Greek Orthodox Church, getting his PhD back in New York City. And he took the 3 letters, translated them, and explained what the 3 of them thought happened. And here's a synopsis. There were 200 bishops there. Each bishop brought 2 priests. And they stayed from probably May through the middle of July, and they hammered this question out. And they finally came up with the Apostles' Creed. I've read the Apostles' Creed in church every Sunday for 84 years. Well, not exactly, but a lot. And I've had to reinterpret it to a point where I really like the one we do now, Mary. It's pretty simple.
Which is based on Paul's letter to the Ephesians.
There are lots of people who read that Nicene Creed and won't come to church because they can't believe it. Well, remember who it was written for. Over 2,000 years ago. So we've got a situation where they've got a political problem. Now, you understand, I'm like the guy who is showing these ink blotches by their therapist. Says, what do you see? He sees a picture of the sex act. Well, everything I look at, I see political. I don't see it partisan political. I see it political in the sense that it's relationships. And here, Constantine had this problem. He brought these people together, and they hammered out an agreement, and 8 wouldn't sign it. They were exiled. What happened? Arian was exiled. Within a few years, they all came back. So, I've got a bit of Arianism in me. I see Jesus as truly human, but I see Christ as a divine being. What is that? How did they get to there? Well, another word I have trouble with is homostasis. Who knows what homostasis means? And I'm not asking any of the priests or pastors. I wonder if there's anybody here that knows what that word means, that wants to speak up.
Are you sure you want to say the word homeostasis? I think that's not the right word. I think it's homoousios.
Close enough. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Homeostasis has to do with biology.
Well,
Nothing to do with Christian
What did you
theology.
say, Mary? What's the word?
It's homoousios.
thank you. I didn't even spell it right.
I wondered when you mentioned it yesterday what the hell you're talking about. Well, it's Wally, he has it'll become clear.
You know what I mean.
I know.
Don't listen to what I said.
Yeah. So what's the word we're talking about there?
The word is homoousios, and then there's another word that I can't remember. So
Yeah,
We still didn't hear it.
homoousios, it's HOMOUSIAS, or there might be two O's. Okay.
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, let's get somebody like George to speak on this. Someone who maybe knows his Greek better than I do.
what's it mean?
I don't know.
Can I guess?
Sure.
So homo means same, and ousios, just because we're talking about Arianism, I'm gonna guess has something to do with substance. So it's like same substance.
Father and son are one substance.
Yeah.
That's what it means. That's what they,
Way to go, Miranda! Woohoo!
Yeah, that's what they agreed to.
That the Father and the Son are the same substance.
Yes.
Now, Mary,
Don't ask me.
I'm asking you,
Well, don't.
what do we in the contemporary church believe?
I'm not sure what you're asking. Many people believe many different things. We believe that there is, we believe in a Trinitarian God.
Of one substance?
Of one substance, three persons, Trinity of being, dancing together,
Can't look at notes.
living, I don't have notes, living in overflowing love and perfect communion. That's what I believe. I don't know if that's what we believe. So you may be looking for some right answer that I don't have.
No. What I was looking for was to jump ahead to a point where we could hear what we collectively accept as an explanation of the Trinitarian God. And cut out all of the history. Now, you did it.
Well, I think the history is important, though, so that you know why certain issues show up in the creed that came out of the Council of Nicaea and other issues don't, because, as you say, it was a political issue of the time that these were the things that they were arguing about. And now that this is the official religion of the empire, the emperor wants there to be one central way of stating it, not all of this diversity and chaos that existed before it was a state religion. And it was fine to exist in the time of Paul and Thomas and the writings. They could have diversity, but in the Roman Empire, the emperor didn't want diversity.
Well,
He wanted unity of belief so it could be well structured and organized and get rid of this chaos.
So you could argue that it's a political document, not a theological document.
I think it's both.
It's a yes and.
So what-
It's a yes and.
It's just to know that that's what they were arguing about. If we're arguing about something different in the 21st century, we might come up with something different. But historically, this is like the final document that generally all of the bishops of the then Universal Church were willing to sign off on. So it's like the final statement of belief that everybody, in quotes, agreed to.
When
But
they come to,
isn't that the Western Church? Eastern Orthodox did not go that route. Isn't that when the division occurred?
Yes, they went that route, but they have one different way of talking about proceeding from.
From the Spirit, yeah.
Yeah.
From the Spirit of Christ, yes.
But it's basically the same document, and in fact, many in the Western Church today, including a suggestion in the Episcopal Church, is to take out the line in the creed that is the single, it's not even a line, it's a subphrase, the single subphrase that is not in the Eastern Orthodox Nicene Creed, so that we would get back to the universal practice.
To me, the one substance is what translates to us now. To me, that has translated very well in modern times because it has some mystical qualities. It isn't pinned down in such a specific way that we get the spirit of one substance. It's like music or poetry. We get it intuitively. Maybe one substance is what has allowed us to accept the Trinity.
Even today, 2,000 or 1,500 years later.
To me, that is out of time and space. It's not tied to a particular historical moment
Right.
or culture. And so that gives it tremendous possibility.
Well, it clearly has staying power, right? I mean, we may be struggling with it today, in different pieces and parts of the creed, but it is a document that has been with the church for a long time.
Mary, I just wanted to clarify, the line we're speaking of is the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son?
Yes. I think in the Eastern Orthodox they take out and the Son.
Father and the Son.
No,
And the
proceeds
Son.
from the Father,
And the
but
Son.
not the Son.
Take away the Son, yes.
It's about who proceeds from who,
I know it.
which is not really our question,
Seems
possibly.
like quite a fight.
Well, if you think about it, history is written by the victor. So if we think about the Council of Nicaea, if it had gone the other way, Christianity as we know it would look completely different. We can't even begin to speculate what Christianity would look like today. Because all we know is what has won, quote unquote. So,
Yeah, it's sort of like looking at it, the metaphor of a political convention trying to decide what the platforms would be.
Yes.
One could make the argument that had Constantine not been the one picking up the tab for these 600 clerics to sit around and talk about these, and knowing his desires, Mary pointed out, that we need to get this unified because I need this to unify the empire. They might not have come up with this at all. It might have been a completely different decision. So then it raises, I think, the interesting question of how much, to speak to Wally's concern, how much of belief has to be predicated on dogma as opposed to predicated on, as Wally likes to call it, the story.
yeah.
And the Nicene Creed, in my being outside the Christian community, looking back at it, is to me a very political document because it had a political purpose. And yes, we all agreed that people that got sent away that were later welcomed back, we just needed to shut them up for a while until things took hold, and then we can all be forgiving and everything can go forward. At that point, there was no way it was going to change. So I think that's the interesting aspect.
Well, it's just a document crafted by politicians to find a theology they could all agree on, and therefore it doesn't. It's not a political document in any religious sense. It's simply a document that everyone can sign off on because up until 1600, 1700, the ruler of the country decided the religion, no exceptions. No exceptions.
So when
It
did
had to
Jesus
please-
become the Christ?
Constantine, I'm sorry.
When did Jesus become the Christ? What's your answer?
My answer is, I focus on core value. I'm thinking a lot about core values. My core values were formed by my parents, who were Christians. And for me, Christ was always part of God. Now, when did Christ become part of God? If I were to answer it in a historic way, I'd say 200 years after the Vulgate Bible was written, and they were hammering out this story. But it clearly wasn't before 325, in my mind.
Would it have happened if John hadn't been written?
Well,
It's hard for
I'm
me to make the argument.
why Thomas wasn't substituted for God, John. Thomas, I've always liked John because the way it starts. But Thomas is really quite insightful.
Why did they leave Thomas out?
Say it again.
Why did they leave Thomas out?
I wish I knew. And I can't, again, I look at it, and nobody knows. Because we weren't privy to the conversations that went on among the leaders of the church in the 4th century. But they were promoting a story. They had a story they wanted to, they had a way they wanted to tell the story. And so they dumped the story through 3 books that were all awfully similar.
Well, but John is so much different.
John is different and competed with Thomas in terms of
My question
timing.
is, if John hadn't been written, if that hadn't been adopted as the gospel, would you have gotten the Nicene Creed? I don't think so. Because it's a different story. You know that.
I know it.
So, I guess then the question to answer David's speculation, why did they pick John and not Thomas?
I wish I knew.
Apparently there weren't an equivalent set of letters like your scholar friend had found that came out of Nicaea from bishops talking about
Yes.
the backstory at Nicaea for the backstory of pulling together the canon when they did as they did.
So obviously it must have been something in Thomas that somebody didn't square.
This doesn't support, the major story. It's a series of sayings that ask you to reflect, and it has really no dogma in it at all.
Some of the sayings may not support the dogma that needed to be propagated.
They're more questions that one does as an individual. They don't have to do with community forming
And Francie, is the Gospel of Thomas less about the events of Jesus' life, and it's completely about saying, so it's called a gospel in the sense that it is a telling of the good news, but it's not a gospel in the sense that it is the story of a man's life. And I'm thinking less about the theology of the sayings and more that they wanted stories that included the crucifixion.
David?
Yeah, I guess my mind always goes full circle. I ask all these same questions if I made a student at Uni College, although my intellectual capabilities minuscule compared to yours. But I come back to what Emily said. Not only is history written by the victors, academia is shaped by the same mindset, by the victors. The powers that be fund the schools, fund the people who are studying and writing this stuff down. So if we rely on history to clarify all this, I think, that doesn't work. And in my mind, same with academia. If we just look to the scholars and academia to prove all this, it doesn't really work for me. So my mind flips it. Rather than how did Jesus become God. In my mind now I'm thinking, why did God become Jesus?
I ask myself regularly, and again, this is just the weird way my mind works. I like to sit with Tim and Titus and Paul when they're trying to figure out how to raise money to get to Spain. How are we going to do this? And I'd love to sit with the leadership of the church and see how they chose to see that for 2,000 years we had a story to build our metaphor on. Now, I can't do it. I'm happy to sit here with you and keep pondering these specific kinds of questions, which is more fun than I'm entitled to have at my age. The one thing that, when we put this 4-hour course together, I wish that we had the 8 years of research that Erdman had done. And yet we have 4 hours in Lent. And we did religion at the time of Jesus. We did the history of Jesus. Now we're looking and pondering the mystery of Christ. And next week we're going to do where is Christ in our community today? Because I think we're still interpreting who Christ is very differently within the modern culture. But we have an evolutionary culture at the time of Nicaea that it's not perfectly easy to interpret because we don't have enough data. And by the way, there's no Fox News or CNN. There's no way to get all this information. And we're dealing with something that's very esoteric because we know we've all got a God gene. I'd be surprised if any of us would question that in final analysis. And that works inside our human body in a way that we want to understand our understanding of God. I need to be able to talk to God myself. I do. Occasionally I talk to Mary, and then I get myself straightened out. Yeah.
You know, I do have a question. On the Nicene Creed, were they just so unhappy with the Gnostics that they didn't want any of that in there? Because Gnosticism was sort of a more spiritual way of looking at things, and I thought that was why they made the choice of books originally anyway. And I don't believe the Gnostics were accepted there at Nicaea.
I would say I'm so sorry that the baby got thrown out with the bathwater, but there was some pretty nasty bathwater in Gnosticism. So it's not just like, oh, there were some bad guy power bishops that were trying to push down spirituality. Gnosticism comes from the word gnosis, knowledge, and it was secret knowledge. Secret knowledge that only certain people could have, was not available really to everyone, and it was highly, in many places, highly dualistic, destructively dualistic. So there are some things about Gnosticism that I'm pretty glad that we shut the door on it, but there were some things about Gnosticism that I think it's too bad that they slammed it so hard. So I think they were responding to Gnosticism, but as Wally says, they're also responding to Arianism, and there were a variety of diverse, chaotic, we now call them heretical opinions that were having the church go willy-nilly. And I just think that for the church to be empire, which was good news because you're not dying anymore for your faith, but bad news because now you're empire, there had to be uniformity of belief.
It's hard to build a political polity on Gnosticism. Because if you're not privy to the knowledge, They're not part of the Pope. And how is the entire Roman Empire going to become privy to the knowledge? Because not everyone can be privy to the knowledge. Plus the Manichaean aspects of, well, a good God couldn't have created this. There must be an evil sub-God that actually made this mistake. It gets so wound up, you can't, I don't understand how you can build an empire like that. It wouldn't work.
Is there a relationship between that and the spiritualism of the Celtic tradition where God is everywhere and everything, which was a threat to the organized church?
Well, I think mysticism is always a threat to the organized church wherever you find it, and the organized church will be more or less open to it, just kind of depending on the time, whether or not you get burned at the stake for being a mystic or not, or just shut out of the room.
Correct?
I think we lost some valuable insight by not including some of the Gnostic Gospels.
Now, my Greek scholar made the argument or explained where the bishops were able to travel from and where they didn't travel from, and they were easier to Nicaea from the east than from the west, which he would suggest changed the nature of the theological argument based on the people who were there, which is interesting. Now, I've never went and tried to pin a map to show who traveled from where, but it's a fascinating issue.
And it's I'm just, I tie my little brain in knots, because on one hand, I think it's really good to have an approach to any of this where you have a certain degree of suspicion, like who was able to get into the room, who was even invited into the room. All of that, the history goes to the victor go the spoils. And I also believe that the Holy Spirit is acting through human beings, and we often don't get it right because we're broken, and our ways of being in the world are steeped in sin. But God is still acting through us, and so having to kind of, as best we can, discern and sort that out, I think is tricky.
I would say that leaping way forward, but in time, but the Quaker idea is that there is that of God in every human being, and that includes people who are not Christian, and that raises that question too of what is divine and what is human. And Christ is certainly the basis of the Quaker religion. But the idea that there's a light within us, and maybe that refers to the biological idea that people are born with a wonder of what this mystery is to be, and that the light is shining in everyone. It's there, and that includes the Spirit. That it's there in us, and it's a much broader. I mean, it's not a worry too much about the Nicene Creed, which I think is really interesting. And I love the idea of the Trinity, because that's a little broader too, in a way. But I love learning about the historical Jesus. I want to know, but the other issue issue is the spiritual connection. And so I guess that's all I have to say.
When I think of that time when people were illiterate, you know, if you compare that to, we can pick up multiple things. I believe Christianity might have survived at all had that structure not been put in place. And so I see it as a structure that was meant for that time, and that we've now evolved to the point where we can be a little more sophisticated in our faith and have a little more leeway to find our way to God without being literal. And I find that reassuring, even though we may not completely agree with the original structure. It allowed Christianity to spread, and we've all come back to really being very interested in Jesus' teachings. So it was a very good vehicle. It has been, I think, a good vehicle to bring these teachings.
Any other comments?
Well, that raises the interesting question of whether Christianity would have survived if it had not become the religion of the empire.
Precisely.
Would the Christians have been persecuted out of existence?
Right. That's what I suspect.
Yeah, so,
Find another way.
Well, they wouldn't have survived if they hadn't been given instruction. There's no major religion I can think of that survives without a solid structure.
But to Mary's point, maybe that was God working through humans.
Well, I was thinking about the other Marian when she was talking about the light. The light is in each of us. That even if I'm critical of what went on a little bit at Nicaea, that was a group of bishops and their assisting clergy who also all had the light in them, ostensibly.
Christianity, Islam, conversions were from the top down, not from the bottom up. The original church that you talked about, we don't know where that came from. That's a great mystery. To me, that's one of the most interesting things. It's the mystery of what happened before the Nicene Creed. But it's a organized religion almost universally is top down, which I think is an interesting aspect.
Jack?
I have a question. Wasn't the Gospel of Thomas found in one of the jars of the Dead Sea Scrolls, along with other Gnostic Gospels?
15 of them. And they were tucked away in they were tucked away in about 367 because they were condemned.
So how come they like to keep the Gospel of Thomas and not some of the other Gnostic Gospels?
I just picked Thomas because it was consistent with the time of John, and so has been designated by scholars as being more likely sayings of Jesus than some of the other ones.
I know one of the other Gnostic Gospels that they discovered in those jars was the Gospel of Judas, which is very interesting.
And Mary. A lot of good ones.
And a lot of them were just fragmentary, if I'm getting my history or archaeology right. And when we look at Christian canon documents of the Gospels and Paul that are that old, they're often fragmentary too, but there's a lot of fragments because they're the winners, right? And when you find a fragment where the only archaeological evidence or historical evidence is this one fragment and you have only like 3 paragraphs cut diagonally, you wish you had more.
Yeah.
I viewed the theologians as philosophers who were able to interpret our religious beliefs in the context of contemporary culture. And as the culture changed, the way in which we would view our religion and fit changed. Now, what's happened in my mind today is the culture is a big cauldron. We've got hourly communications from around the world. We've got travel. We've got an integration of the people. And the religion today has to keep up with that culture. It's got to fit. Religion is a product of culture and not the other way around. So hopefully next week we can get into the issue of how contemporary religion fits in our culture. And Rob Mason from up at the Thomas Apostle Center will be the discussion leader. So please come. And thank you for being here today. What?
That's on Wednesday.
Yes, it's on Wednesday. It's on Wednesday because Thursday is Monday, Thursday. Remember,
How's your daughter doing?
thank you all.
Give you a
Thank you all.
Thank you, Ollie.